Hey everybody, it's me again, Chicken Nooble, and I'm going to make a different type of video than what I normally make, something a little more conversational, so the background footage is going to be mostly irrelevant. Pretty much, I wanted to share two ideas I have about proving raid and strike accessibility and difficulty. Now, just for the sake of this video, to eliminate all confusion when I'm using those terms, this is how I view or define them. There is a point when a player is ready to do an encounter or not. The accessibility of the encounter refers to all the barriers a player must overcome to be ready for the encounter. Gearing up and having a build, understanding your profession and skills, knowing the game mechanics, and being somewhat competent with positioning and combat. Getting a group, knowing how to read and react to skill animations, doing enough DPS to get over a DPS check, and even finding a way to overcome disabilities like a player's color blindness or something else. The more barriers a player has to overcome to have a chance at completing an encounter, the less accessible it is to that player. Now, everything that happens in the encounter is what I would say counts as the challenge. The number of mechanics and the options a player have to handle those mechanics, group checks like enraged timers, movement requirements, enemy attributes like health and damage output, and all the rest. Now, when you smash the accessibility and challenge together, that's when I think you can get a really good idea to say if something is difficult, and that's really subjective because difficulty is perceived by the player. A new raider might find a low challenge encounter very difficult because there may be a lot of barriers that they have yet to overcome. And an experienced raider might find a very challenging, mechanically complex encounter very easy because they've been clearing it every week for the last 4 years. Long ago when I played World of Warcraft from launch through Wrath of the Lich King, there was an endgame dungeon and raid progression with keys and attunements. You couldn't just waltz right up to Mount Hyjal without clearing and looting items from the bosses in Tempest Keep and Serpent Shrine Cavern, and you couldn't get into Serpent Shrine Cavern until you cleared Karazhan, Gruul's Lair, and a bunch more content. That lets the WoW developers assume that you have a certain level of skill and gear because they forced you to overcome certain challenges and rewarded you for doing so. Final Fantasy XIV, with the little bit that I played of that game, had something similar because new dungeons, areas, and features of the game were locked behind the completion of the main story quest and side quests. The Final Fantasy XIV developers could introduce harder encounters later in the game because the player was progressing through a mostly linear story, and it's likely that they overcame less difficult encounters already. Now, contrast that with Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2 is an incredibly open and unrestricting game, and this presents a lot of problems for designing endgame encounters because the developers have no way to control whether or not the player completed content that would be preparing them for a raid encounter. I've heard a lot of different people give their ideas on how to address this issue, but I don't think most of them are really that feasible without going into a massive overhaul of the game and adjusting the game's design philosophy, or the solutions just don't address the biggest issue, which I think is accessibility. Developers could add more challenges to the personal story in classic dungeons, but that could be problematic because players may not have the necessary weapon or utility skills at level 35 to overcome those challenges in Ascalonian catacombs. Plus, players could simply skip that content altogether, which would defeat the purpose. The game could force players into a personal story and classic dungeon path, like Final Fantasy XIV does, but that's kinda antithetical to the game's design philosophy. Hey guys, just a quick post-production note. I was just about ready to release this video yesterday, but ArenaNet published a blog post on February 12th talking about endgame rewards and EOD strikes. It looks like they're going to make some EOD strike access dependent on the player completing certain story missions, and that will help with the accessibility of those strike missions. There may be more attunements and content locking coming to the game. I just wanted to say that before someone jumps into the comments section to tell me that. So let's continue. So what about the idea of fine-tuning the challenge of each encounter so there's a progressive ramp? Well, that could work, but players can do raids and strikes out of order since there's no attunement process. I think the best idea that I've heard is the concept of an easy mode encounter, something that is less challenging with lower health pools and fewer mechanics, so players can clear that content. My concern with this approach is that it lowers the bar so players can get a kill, but it creates another difficulty gap just to get to normal mode, and it truly doesn't address any of the accessibility issues that players have. My solution would be to focus on making normal mode encounters more accessible and not less challenging, and this is vitally important. Mechanically, the normal mode encounter stays exactly the same. Instead, I'd add a training mode to every normal encounter. Activating the mode would do 5 things to help the players learn. 1, the training mode isn't only about progression. Foremost, it's about training, so I would add training mode effects to the boss and players. The effect would respawn the boss after 60 seconds if it's killed, and prevent players from earning achievements while fighting the boss. I'd also prevent players from progressing through the dungeon while the training mode effect is active. The reward for killing the boss in training mode is the chance to do it again, some personal growth since you have a little bit more experience, maybe a few unidentified gear, and the friends you made along the way. Second, while the moat is active, I'd let players interact with it to learn more about the mechanics of the fight. Let them know exactly what to expect and give them ideas on how to counter those mechanics. Since Veiled Guardian is the first raid boss, the interface could talk about unstable magic spikes, distributed magic, seeker orbs, what happens when the Veiled Guardian enters a split phase, and how the encounter progresses. A message that says, every 15 seconds 3 red seeker orbs will spawn and slowly move toward players, and that the push and pull skills can be used to keep the orbs away, could actually be useful because now the player knows how to counter those mechanics. It might be a complex dialogue tree, but I think it's important to explain some of this stuff about the fight to players who really want to learn the fight. Third, the training mode should give text cues to the players to help them get through certain mechanics. For instance, again with Veiled Guardian, the edge of your screen glows orange and you can hear a sound if you're standing inside of a teleport circle. But for me, I play on a large ultra-wide monitor and it's difficult to see the screen glowing orange without turning my head away from where the fight is. And I don't hear the sound because of all the other noise in game. Now I have good eyesight, head mobility, and hearing, so somebody with a disability may have a harder time with learning these mechanics. Flashing a message right in the middle of the screen, kinda like the squad alert message, could help train players. Something simple like avoid unstable magic spike or distributed magic appeared, so players know to look for and react to that mechanic. And fourth, I'd add some timers on the side of the screen for mechanics that happen at certain timed intervals. Knowing when something is going to happen is good, so players know to look for the mechanic, observe the animation and tells, and react as necessary. Now the final thing I would add to the training mode would be a way for squads to add modifiers to their encounter. Things like boosting damage output or reducing damage taken by a percentage, allowing downstate, maybe pulsing effects like stability or alacrity at some interval. This isn't to push players into the God mode status, but to show them that if they use certain abilities during their fight or improve their attributes and performance, that they will progress a little bit easier. A squad could turn everything on and remove some of the effects as they get more comfortable. Now, none of that changes the mechanics of the fight. It doesn't push players to the top tier players. All of these ideas would improve accessibility of the encounter without lowering the skill bar because it's still up to the players to execute and counter all the mechanics that you would need to kill the normal mode boss. What this doesn't address is helping the player overcome gearing, buildcraft, rotations, and learning their professions. Although one of my 5 points does include recommending certain skill effects and types to handle certain mechanics, so I guess that would help somewhat. I have separate ideas for that stuff though, so maybe I'll cover it in a different video or talk about it on stream sometime. Anyways, the whole point of all of that is by padding the encounter with optional accessibility modifiers, we start to reduce the accessibility gap, meaning the encounter might finally be within reach of a player, and getting that player into that encounter is the first step to having them clear it. Honestly, this idea is an in-game implementation of what a training raid leader would do anyways, explaining mechanics, the verbal tells, tell about upcoming attacks. These ideas are really to help the trainers and squads prepare for the normal mode encounter. But now some of you may be wondering, well, should that apply to challenge mode? And I would say no, it doesn't. Challenge modes exist to be challenging. I do think it would be fun to make challenge modes even harder by adding gambits to every challenge mode encounter. For those who don't know, during the Festival of the Four Winds, there's an event called the Queen's Gauntlet. Players can spawn bosses to fight one-on-one in the gauntlet, and for an additional challenge, they can add one or more gambits to a single fight. Maybe some of the Queen's Gauntlet gambits would make the encounters more challenging, but I could also see encounter-specific gambits, like the radius of an attack being increased by X percentage, or that other attacks would instantly kill the squad if one player fails at a mechanic. While the training mode is all about extending accessibility toward the player, the gambits on the challenge modes would be to increase the encounter challenge away from the players by adjusting some variables. For every active gambit, maybe you would get an extra gold and increased chance for ascended materials whenever you kill the boss, but let's take it a step further and go even crazier. I know ArenaNet doesn't really like prestige items, but it would be cool to see additional achievements for clearing a CM with 3 gambits, or 5 gambits, or all the gambits. Maybe 3 gambits would award a special title, and 5 gambits would award a special outfit, mount, or glider skin. And maybe finishing an encounter with all the gambits would give the player a novelty gizmo of the boss writhing in pain above the player's head. You guys probably know I'm not a raider. I actually just started my raiding journey last month. From my perspective, I think that this stuff would help accessibility and get people into raids and strike encounters. What about the rest of you? Regardless of your raiding experience, what do you think? Would something like this help you out or make your encounters more enjoyable? Let me know in the comments below, or feel free to stop by this channel's Discord server, or stop by the stream sometime and let's talk about it. I stream on YouTube a few times each week, so subscribing and hitting that notification bell will let you know when I go live. Until then, stay safe, be kind to each other, and I'll see you around.